You don't belong here, ma'am. First class is for real passengers, not people like you. The words didn't come with a raised voice or a slammed tray table. They came with something worse, a steady, polished tone that cut deep because it was meant to. Lindsay Hartman, the lead flight attendant on United Airlines Flight 342, said it with her shoulders square and her chin slightly lifted, like she was reading from a rule book no one else could see. And in that instant, every sound in the cabin seemed to vanish. People stopped reaching for their seatbelts. The man in 1B looked up from his phone. A woman in 2A slowly turned her head. And Vanessa Cole, standing at the front of the plane holding a valid boarding pass for seat 1C, realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something else entirely. Before we go on, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. If you've ever seen someone judged by how they look, hit like and subscribe if you believe respect matters more than appearance. What happened next changed everything. Now let's go back to that aisle. Vanessa didn't move. She didn't blink. She held up her phone with the boarding pass clearly displayed. Seat 1C, she said calmly. Confirmed. First class. But Lindsay didn't lean in. She didn't look closer. She simply folded her arms and replied, "Let me get a supervisor. I've seen this before." That last sentence wasn't protocol. It was judgment. The kind that tells you loud and clear, you've been sized up, and in someone's eyes. You came up short. Vanessa didn't argue. She stepped aside as requested, carefully placed her carry-on next to her feet, and stood quietly in the front galley, just a few feet from her empty seat. She didn't scowl. She didn't make a scene. Instead, she pulled out her phone again and made a brief call. One line. No emotion. "It's happening. 11 minutes. She ended the call and put the phone back in her jacket, behind her. The cabin buzzed, not with noise, but with glances, with people pretending not to watch. A few shifted in their seats. A middle-aged man in 1D looked down, uncomfortable. A woman in 2B whispered something to her husband, and the older woman in 1A, a white blouse, pearl earrings, hair swept into a tight bun, shook her head slowly and murmured, "Here we go again." Lindsay returned, this time with Brooke Simmons, the junior flight attendant, in tow. Brooke's face looked uncertain, but she stayed quiet. Lindsay leaned closer to Brooke and said under her breath, but not quiet enough, "She's trying to sneak into first class. Says she belongs in 1C. Vanessa heard every word, but said nothing. She wasn't trying to prove herself. She was watching, taking it all in. Brooke checked the manifest on her tablet and frowned. "It does say 1C, she whispered. Lindsay waved her off. "We'll double-check it with the gate. Stay alert." The gate agent, summoned by intercom, walked in a minute later, a younger man with a clipboard and a polite smile. He asked Lindsay for the name. Lindsay answered for Vanessa without turning around. "Claiming seat 1C, but we're not sure it's valid." The agent blinked, looked at the boarding pass on Vanessa's screen, scanned it again, then nodded. "It's valid. Cleared. That's her seat." Lindsay looked stunned for a split second, then recovered. "Well, sometimes the system glitches," she muttered. "It happens." She didn't offer an apology. She didn't ask Vanessa to take her seat. She turned and walked away. Brooke remained, visibly uncomfortable now. Vanessa still didn't sit. She waited, watched. She wanted to see what would happen next, not because she was testing anyone, but because moments like this reveal what people really believe. And the cabin was full of belief. Quiet, unspoken, loaded belief. Barbara Whitman, seated in 1A, glanced at Vanessa again and said with a soft scoff, "Entitlement is getting out of hand these days." A man a row behind her chuckled. Janet Rowe, seated in 2C, younger, East Asian, sharp eyes. Egan discreetly recording with her phone. She'd seen this before. She knew what it was. Vanessa remained upright. Her face was neutral, but her presence, calm, composed, undeniable, started to shift the air in the cabin. It was no longer just about a seat. It was about what that seat represented. United Airlines Flight 3. 42 wasn't in the air yet, but a storm had already begun, one built not of wind or turbulence, but perception, judgment, assumptions. And as the flight crew continued prepping, unaware that their moment of truth had already begun. Doctor, Vanessa Cole stood quietly beside the galley, saying nothing, and meaning everything. Vanessa stood quietly near the galley, hands folded loosely in front of her, eyes steady, posture calm. She didn't need to explain herself. Not now. Not to this crew. The seat with her name on it. 1C sat just 10 feet away, still empty, still waiting. But the space between her and that seat had become something much larger, a space filled with doubt, assumption, and silence. Around her. The cabin stirred in quiet discomfort. No one spoke directly to her. No one offered her their voice. Yet everyone was watching. Lindsay returned to the aisle with a fresh clipboard and a new burst of energy, determined to make it look like she was solving a problem instead of creating one. "We're just going to run one more verification," she said out loud, addressing no one in particular but making sure every passenger heard her. "Sometimes people book economy and get bumped up without clearance." Her words floated like smoke, vague enough to sound professional, pointed enough to land exactly where she wanted. A few heads nodded. A man in 2D leaned toward his wife and whispered something about airline fraud. Brooke stood behind Lindsay, her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't quite push it out. Her fingers fidgeted with the tablet clutched to her chest. She kept glancing toward Vanessa, her eyes darting nervously. It wasn't guilt yet, just uncertainty. She was still deciding what kind of person she wanted to be in this moment. Meanwhile, Vanessa said nothing. She didn't raise her voice, didn't explain her credentials, didn't flash her title. She just stood. That alone unsettled Lindsay more than she expected. The silence, the control, the dignity. It didn't match the narrative she was trying to sell. Lindsay stepped back into the galley, whispering sharply into the phone clipped to the wall. "Can someone from the gate double-check this upgrade? Passenger says she's in 1C, but I don't see anything about priority status." Her voice dipped low but carried just enough to keep the tone alive. The one that said we're dealing with something suspicious. Across the aisle. Barbara Whitman, the older woman in 1A with the pearls and the too-perfect bun, leaned over the armrest and looked straight at Vanessa. "Do you travel often?" she asked. Smiling without warmth, Vanessa turned toward her, nodded once, and replied evenly. "Often enough." Barbara kept smiling. "I see. You must work for one of the non-profits. They give upgrade perks now, don't they?" The implication hung between them like a curtain. Vanessa didn't answer, not because she didn't have a response, but because responding would give the moment more dignity than it deserved. Barbara adjusted her seatbelt, clearly expecting acknowledgement, but got none. A soft tension filled the row. A few rows back, Ronald Price, a black man in a tailored navy suit, exhaled slowly and closed his laptop. He didn't say a word, but his body language shifted. He had seen this dynamic before, too many times. And though he wasn't ready to speak up, something in him began to turn. Brooke finally stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said softly to Vanessa, "we're just still checking the manifest, but I'm sorry for the delay." Her voice cracked slightly at the edge. Lindsay shot her a glare. Brooke lowered her eyes and stepped back. The moment of decency had passed. Vanessa gave her a small nod. not of gratitude, but acknowledgement. Just enough to say, "I see you trying." Then silence again. Janet Rowe, sitting in 2C, angled her phone just enough to keep filming. She wasn't live streaming, not yet, but she was capturing everything. She had started filming the moment she heard the sentence, "Not people like you." She knew what that meant, and now she had it on video. She glanced up once, met Vanessa's eyes. There was no smile exchanged, no wink, just mutual understanding, a silent agreement that this mattered, that this wasn't just about a seat. At the rear of the first-class cabin, Captain Glenn Roberts stepped out of the cockpit for a moment, stretching his back. Unaware of the quiet storm forming ahead, he scanned the aisle, caught a glimpse of Lindsay mid-conversation with a visibly tense passenger, and tilted his head. He made a note to check in later. But for now, he disappeared back through the flight deck door. Lindsay returned again, clipboard now shaking slightly in her hands. She was beginning to lose control of the narrative. Vanessa hadn't snapped, hadn't made a scene, but the temperature had changed. The passengers weren't chatting. They weren't sipping their sparkling water or flipping through in-flight magazines. They were watching. Everyone was waiting to see what came next. And that waiting, that silence, was heavy. Vanessa finally took a breath, then gently picked up her briefcase. Still without raising her voice, she asked Brooke a simple question. "Has my boarding pass been changed or canceled?" Brooke blinked. "No, ma'am. You're still in 1C. "Then may I sit down?" Brooke opened her mouth, but Lindsay cut in. "Not yet. I still need to confirm with management." "You've had 10 minutes," Vanessa replied calmly. "And I've been standing." It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even frustration. It was a statement of fact, and it landed like thunder. Behind them. Someone coughed. Another adjusted in their seat. Janet's camera kept rolling. And then, as if on cue, a voice came through the cabin intercom. It wasn't the captain. It wasn't the gate agent. It was from the ground operations manager, a name some of them didn't recognize, but a tone that sounded firm. "Ms. Hartman, please remain where you are. Do not proceed further until you receive clearance." Lindsay's face froze. Brooke's eyes went wide. Vanessa didn't move, but something subtle changed in the way she held herself. It was beginning, and the cabin knew it. There was a moment, right after the voice on the intercom broke the tension, when the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Lindsay stood frozen beside the aisle, gripping her clipboard like it was armor. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. The calm assurance she wore earlier had slipped, and what was left behind was a woman beginning to realize she may have just crossed a line she couldn't walk back. Brooke stepped away instinctively, her hands now clasped in front of her like she was bracing for impact. She didn't look at Lindsay. She looked at Vanessa, and the look said everything. It said, "I didn't stop it. I should have." Vanessa remained near the galley, still standing, still composed, though the weight of the moment had grown heavy in the air. She didn't glance at the passengers. She didn't posture. But the way she adjusted the strap on her briefcase and squared her shoulders spoke volumes. Every move was deliberate, calm, but unmistakably clear. She was no longer waiting to be allowed back to her seat. She was simply watching what they would do with the truth. Then came footsteps, not rushed, not frantic, measured, intentional. Cynthia Lake stepped into the cabin, not with a clipboard or headset like a standard gate agent, but with a sleek navy blazer and the unmistakable presence of someone who didn't answer to middle management. She was United Airlines Director of Customer Experience for the Northeast region, and she didn't travel unless something serious had happened. Lindsay turned first, as if sensing it before she even saw her. "Hi," Yes, she said quickly, almost too brightly. There's been some confusion about a boarding issue. A woman attempted to take seat 1C, but we couldn't verify her priority status. Cynthia held up a hand, not rudely, but with authority. Ms. Hartman, I'm aware of the situation. Her tone was calm, clipped, not open for negotiation. She turned to Vanessa. Dr. Cole? Vanessa nodded once. Yes. That was all. Just one word. But it was like a spotlight cutting through fog. Barbara Whitman in 1A suddenly sat straighter. Janet Rowe blinked twice, realizing what she was seeing. Ronald Price leaned forward, his jaw tight. The weight of those two syllables, Dr. Cole, settled in like a thunderclap muffled in velvet. Cynthia nodded back. Thank you for your patience. You can return to your seat now. No explanation, no apology. Yet, just clarity. Brooke stepped forward, looking rattled. Wait, she's cleared to sit? Lindsay snapped. No one told us. That's enough, Cynthia said, without raising her voice, but somehow, the entire row heard it. Let's step into the galley. It wasn't a request. Lindsay hesitated, then turned stiffly and followed her down the narrow hallway. Brooke lingered for a moment. Dr. Cole, she started, then stopped. Her voice cracked. I'm sorry. Vanessa looked at her, not with anger, but with the kind of calm that comes from seeing everything clearly. You still have time to choose who you are, she said gently. Every day. Brooke swallowed hard and nodded. Then she stepped back and let Vanessa pass. And just like that, Vanessa returned to 1C. She didn't throw her bag down. She didn't sigh. She simply placed her case beneath the seat, sat with grace, and fastened her belt. The silence that followed was louder than anything. Not a whisper, not a breath. Every passenger in first class watched her, and saw her differently now. Ronald Price cleared his throat and looked over. Dr. Cole, he said softly, would you like the aisle to yourself? I can switch with someone. She turned slightly, offered a polite smile. No need, she said. I'm comfortable. 2 rows back. Barbara fidgeted with her necklace. She didn't make eye contact. She reached for her water, her hand slightly trembling. Across the aisle. Janet finally lowered her phone, not because the moment had ended, but because she realized the story was no longer about the injustice. It was about what happened after. Cynthia and Lindsay re-emerged from the galley. Cynthia walked ahead, collected, professional. Lindsay followed, her face pale, her posture stiffer than before. She didn't look at Vanessa. She didn't look at anyone. She turned sharply and disappeared into the rear of the cabin. Brooke remained, standing quietly near the jump seat. Then came another voice, the captain's this time. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Glenn Roberts speaking from the flight deck. We're experiencing a slight delay in departure. Thank you for your patience. His tone was standard, professional, practiced. But something in the pacing betrayed him. He knew something had gone wrong, and he knew passengers knew it too. Cynthia walked forward and spoke briefly with the captain through the open door. When she returned, she made one last stop at row 1. She knelt slightly beside Vanessa's seat. Dr. Cole, she said in a low voice, we'll be making this right. Vanessa looked at her, steady. You already are, she said. Just make sure it lasts after I leave. Cynthia gave a nod that was part apology, part promise. Then she stood and left the cabin. The door closed. The hum of the engines grew louder. Brooke secured her jump seat. Lindsay did not return. And in row 1, Vanessa Cole sat quietly in her seat. Not triumphant, not vindictive, but grounded, solid, seen. The cabin was still. Nothing had taken off yet, But everything had already changed. The hum of the cabin softened into a quiet waiting room, thick with awareness. First class didn't usually feel like this. It was often filled with idle scrolling, business calls cut short, glasses clinking softly on tray tables. But now, no one moved much. No one spoke loudly. The presence of truth had changed the air. Vanessa sat still in 1C, composed, looking straight ahead as if none of it touched her. But everyone around her knew better. They knew they had just witnessed something shift. A black woman had walked into a space they believed required explanation, and she hadn't offered one. And still, she stayed. Across the aisle. Barbara Whitman finally set her water down. She'd stopped sipping it 3 minutes ago, but kept holding the glass like a lifeline. She hadn't said another word since Vanessa returned to her seat. Her eyes drifted from the seat back in front of her to the cabin door and back again, never meeting Vanessa's gaze. A few rows behind. Janet Rowe was now texting furiously. The video she recorded earlier had been sent to a friend who worked in PR. She didn't know if it would go public yet, but she was documenting everything. The world needed to see what happened, not just the moment of insult, but the power of how Vanessa handled it. Then, from the front galley, came a new presence. Not Cynthia this time, someone else. A tall man in a dark gray suit stepped into the cabin and made his way down the aisle with the kind of walk that said he didn't normally show up here. His name tag read, Malcolm Rhodes, Corporate Counsel, United Airlines. A hush followed him like a shadow. He wasn't smiling. He didn't stop to chat. He moved with purpose. Behind him, Tom Delgado, the terminal's lead operations manager, carried a folder under his arm and a portable printer in the other. Together. They looked like a team brought in not to investigate, but to finalize. Captain Glenn Roberts emerged once again from the flight deck, meeting Malcolm near the galley. They exchanged a brief conversation, low and serious, before Glenn nodded and stepped aside. Then Malcolm turned to Brooke. His voice was calm but direct. "Can you please ask Ms. Hartman to come forward?" Brooke froze for a moment. Then she stood and walked briskly to the back of the plane. A few minutes passed, the kind of minutes that stretch. Vanessa didn't move. She didn't react. She simply crossed her legs, gently rested her hand on the armrest, and waited. Passengers sensed it. This wasn't just about correcting a seating error anymore. This was about policy, accountability, identity. Lindsay Hartman returned, walking stiffly up the aisle, her expression a mix of confusion and defiance. She paused when she saw Malcolm and Tom. "What's going on?" she asked, keeping her voice low but laced with irritation. "I've already reported everything." Malcolm raised his hand. "Ms. Hartman," he began. "We've reviewed the full incident, including audio from the intercom system and gate logs. We also received a direct alert from our executive systems department the moment this event triggered a priority protocol." "Priority protocol?" Lindsay echoed, glancing toward Brooke, who lowered her eyes. "Dr. Vanessa Cole," Malcolm continued, turning slightly toward Vanessa without making a scene, "is not only a ticketed first-class passenger, but a contracted executive partner of United Airlines with strategic clearance. What occurred in the last 15 minutes is in direct violation of both our customer respect policy and leadership alignment standards." Lindsay looked stunned. "I was just doing my job," she said. She didn't look. She stopped herself, but the damage was done. Malcolm tilted his head, just slightly. "That is exactly the problem." Then he opened the folder, pulled out a single-page printed form, and handed it to her. "Effective immediately. You are removed from service on this flight and placed on administrative review pending final determination. You may collect your personal items and deplane with the station supervisor." Lindsay's mouth opened, then closed. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, for a moment longer than she should have. and turned around as she walked back down the aisle, the same aisle she had strutted through just minutes earlier. She passed passengers who had watched it all unfold, and though no one said anything to her directly, the silence spoke for them. Tom Delgado followed her out. Brooke stayed near the galley, visibly shaken. Captain Glenn stepped forward to address the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said over the intercom, "we appreciate your patience. Our crew adjustment is now complete, and we'll begin final departure preparations shortly." His voice was even, measured, but for those listening closely, it carried something else, the quiet weight of regret. Cynthia returned briefly, met Vanessa's eyes from the galley, and gave her a short nod. Then she turned and exited without a word. Her work was done. Vanessa looked down at her phone, not to scroll, not to escape, but to mark the time. 11 minutes. From insult to intervention, from accusation to accountability. She didn't gloat. She didn't shift in her seat. She simply breathed. Across the aisle. Ronald Price finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "That was one of the most dignified things I've ever seen." Vanessa turned toward him, gave a small, respectful nod. "Sometimes dignity's the only thing they can't take from you," she replied. A few rows back, a young woman clapped, softly, hesitantly, and was joined by one more, then another. It never turned into a standing ovation. Vanessa would have hated that. But it was just enough, just human enough, to remind the entire cabin that what they'd witnessed mattered. Brooke walked forward. Now alone at the front of the cabin, she leaned slightly toward Vanessa. "We have a new crew coming on board. Would you like anything while we wait?" Vanessa looked at her, this time with a soft, forgiving expression. "Water would be nice," she said gently. "Cold, if possible." Brooke nodded quickly and disappeared behind the galley curtain. And so Vanessa sat there, not just in 1C, but in control. She hadn't demanded it. She hadn't needed to. She just waited, and let the truth arrive in its own time. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin of United Airlines Flight 342 had changed, but not in any loud or dramatic way. It was subtle, felt more than seen, as the plane prepared for takeoff. A kind of hush settled over everyone, like the final seconds before a storm passes and the sky forgets how to speak. The incident with Lindsay Hartman was over, but its residue clung to the air, thick with the weight of reflection. Vanessa Cole, still seated in 1C, hadn't moved much. She didn't need to. Her stillness wasn't passive. It commanded space. She didn't glare. She didn't posture. She simply existed without apology. And that, somehow, seemed to rattle people more than any outburst could have. A few rows behind, Ronald Price, the retired professor, sat with his hands clasped in front of his lips, deep in thought. He'd seen things in his lifetime, marches, speeches, broken glass and burning buses. But something about this moment felt just as important. Not because it was loud, but because it was so ordinary. A black woman had been wrongly judged, stripped of dignity, and then calmly took it back. And everyone had to sit with that. Across the aisle, Barbara Whitman, who had previously smirked at Vanessa, now seemed visibly uncomfortable. Her arms were folded, eyes flicking left and right, like she couldn't quite decide where to look. She wasn't used to being the one people judged, not in this cabin, not in this zip code. Her son had texted her earlier, something about a client meeting. She considered replying, but her fingers hovered over the phone and then retreated. What could she say? That she'd just witnessed what quiet grace looks like, or that she'd failed to offer even basic decency. Barbara had always seen herself as a fair person, but fairness isn't fairness if it folds under assumptions. Meanwhile, A younger couple seated in 2D and 2E were whispering softly. The woman leaned toward her husband and said, "I hope our daughter becomes a woman like that someday." He nodded silently, his jaw tightening. Neither of them had intervened earlier, and they felt that now. Guilt is a quiet thing, and it doesn't always scream. It lingers. Farther back in 4A. Janet Rowe was reviewing her video clip again. She hadn't posted it publicly. Yet. But she knew she would. Not for clicks. But because this story needed witnesses. In a world where so many moments like this go unseen or unchallenged. Hers had been recorded, and she had no intention of letting it vanish into silence. She added a caption draft. "What happens when you mess with the wrong passenger? United. You need to do better. We all do." She saved it in her notes for now. Across the cabin. A flight attendant brought Vanessa a cold bottle of water and a fresh cloth napkin. "Thank you," Vanessa said simply, her voice calm and full. The attendant gave a soft nod and stepped back, avoiding any grand gestures. It wasn't needed. The kindness had already been received. The captain's voice came through the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your patience. We'll be departing shortly. Please ensure your devices are in airplane mode and your seatbelts are fastened." The usual tone. But now, those words floated through a cabin that was paying attention. Everyone was tuned in, not just to the safety briefing, but to themselves. There's a strange thing that happens when people witness injustice up close and personal. Some shrink away, uncomfortable. Others lean in, changed. In seat 3B, an older black man named Reverend Elijah Duncan, dressed in a dark gray suit and reading a pocket Bible earlier, looked toward Vanessa with quiet admiration. He recognized the kind of strength that doesn't perform for attention. It simply exists. He whispered a prayer, not for her, but for the world around her. A world still trying to catch up to her calm courage. In contrast, not everyone seemed changed. A white man in 3C scrolled through his phone, oblivious or perhaps determined to appear so. His eyes never left the screen. Some people choose silence as a shield. That's fine. But silence never saves anyone when the moment calls for presence. The engines finally roared to life, humming under the cabin floor as the aircraft taxied down the runway. And with each inch it rolled. The tension lifted, not erased but absorbed into something else. Respect, reflection, and, for some, reckoning. As the plane lifted off the ground, climbing steadily into the early evening sky, Vanessa looked out the window, not to escape, not to dream, just to breathe. She'd been through worse than this. What she endured today wasn't new. But the way it ended, the way the tide turned quietly in front of a crowd that never expected it, that felt different. She wasn't just sitting in first class anymore. She was sitting in something bigger. The proof that power doesn't always come loud or dressed in designer labels. Sometimes it comes quietly, with your back straight and your voice steady, and you don't have to raise it, because the room does it for you. As the seatbelt light dimmed, a man from row 4 came forward, paused by Vanessa's seat, and said gently, "I just wanted to say, thank you." Vanessa gave him a small nod, her tone gracious but firm. "You're welcome," she said, "but I didn't do it for applause." He smiled and returned to his seat. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't ask for reward. It just shows up and stays put. The rest of the cabin, now quieter than ever, leaned into the stillness. And while the flight had only just begun, the journey everyone had taken, with their eyes, their assumptions, and their hearts, was already well underway. Vanessa reclined slightly, took a sip of her water, and let the silence wrap around her like armor. She didn't need to say a word. She had already spoken louder than anyone else on that plane. Somewhere over Colorado, cruising at 36,000 feet. The cabin lights had dimmed just enough to create a quiet, reflective glow. Most passengers had settled into their routines, some reading, some watching movies, others pretending to sleep but clearly still turning the earlier incident over in their minds. Vanessa Cole remained calm, reclined slightly, her hands folded in her lap, her mind focused, not on what had happened, but on what needed to happen next. She wasn't just another passenger flying from Chicago to San Francisco. She was en route to a civil rights symposium hosted by the National Social Equity Council, an event where she was scheduled to be the keynote speaker the very next day. But no one around her knew that yet, not even the crew. She didn't carry herself with a sense of celebrity, and there was no entourage or assistant holding her purse. Vanessa never traveled that way. She believed her work spoke loud enough, but it wasn't until a curious murmur began to ripple through the rows behind her that the realization began to spread. It started innocently. Janet Rowe, the passenger who had recorded the confrontation, had posted a short, captioned version of the video to her social feed once the plane's Wi-Fi kicked in, within minutes. It began to pick up traction. People were resharing, commenting, tagging United Airlines. But the part that changed everything was what happened about 12 minutes later. A retired journalist from the Bay Area Tribune who followed Janet replied under the video, "Is that Vanessa Cole, the CEO of the Liberty Justice Foundation? If so, United just messed with the wrong woman." That single comment cracked everything open. Row 3's Reverend Duncan saw it first. Then Barbara Whitman's phone buzzed with a message from her daughter, who had already seen the clip. "Mom, is this the woman you were flying with? She's incredible. Look her up." Barbara's hands trembled slightly as she opened a browser tab and typed the name in. Vanessa M. Cole. The search results exploded with headlines. Civil rights attorney, Harvard Law graduate, founder and CEO of Liberty Justice Foundation. Listed by Time as one of the 25 most influential black women in America, legal advisor to 2 former presidents, tireless advocate for equity, dignity, and systemic reform. Her breath caught. This woman, this quiet, composed, well-dressed passenger she had doubted just an hour ago, was a national leader in the fight for everything she herself claimed to believe in, and Barbara had written her off because of what? A hairstyle? A tone of voice? A skin tone? She felt the full weight of her shame settle into her chest like a stone. Meanwhile, the back of the cabin was stirring with quiet realization. 2 younger passengers whispered, "I think she's the one who helped write the Equal Housing Act revision in 23. "No way! That's her?" one of them replied. But it was the flight attendant in the galley, Sandra, who found herself frozen in place as she stared at the article that now glowed from her phone screen. Her chest tightened. She remembered the tone in Lindsay Hartman's voice earlier, the phrase, "You don't belong here," and how casually it had been thrown out like garbage. But Vanessa hadn't just belonged in first class. She'd built programs to protect people from exactly that kind of treatment. Sandra closed her eyes for a moment, the burn of guilt sitting heavy in her throat. She had served Vanessa water. She had been polite, but she hadn't intervened. And that silence now felt louder than anything else. In the cockpit, the news had quietly reached Captain Mitchell, too. A call from United's operations team had buzzed through. Apparently, corporate had already been notified. Janet's video had gone viral, and legal was preparing a response. The captain nodded to himself. He looked down the long aisle from the cockpit door and shook his head. "She gave every chance for grace," he whispered, "and we failed to give it back." Back in 1C, Vanessa was well aware of the ripple she had triggered, but she never once reached for attention. She didn't gloat. She didn't turn around and ask for acknowledgement. That wasn't her style. Her power came from restraint, from letting truth do the talking. And in this case, Truth was spreading. Silently. Virally. Righteously. Ronald Price. The retired professor in row 2 leaned forward and finally said what many had been thinking. "Ma'am," he spoke gently, "I just want to say, it's an honor to be on this flight with you." Vanessa looked up, surprised, and smiled. "Thank you," she said kindly, "but I'm just a passenger." "Maybe," he nodded, "but you reminded all of us who we really are when no one's watching." She paused for a moment, touched. Then she added, "I didn't come here to teach anyone a lesson. I just came to get to San Francisco in peace." The honesty in her voice hit differently than any speech could. And yet, it was more powerful than most speeches people had ever heard. From across the aisle, a man who hadn't even looked her way earlier now offered her his business card. "If your foundation ever needs corporate partnership, I'd be proud to support it." Vanessa accepted the card graciously, but tucked it away without promise. Her work had never been about donors or praise. It was about progress, slowly, quietly, seat by seat. The passengers of Flight 342 began to shift, not because Vanessa had demanded it, but because she'd shown what dignity looks like when it refuses to be diminished. And that, more than any press release, was what would haunt United Airlines for weeks to come. The seatbelt sign chimed on again as the plane prepared to descend into San Francisco. The cabin lights brightened, but even before they touched down, a transformation had already happened, not just in the flight crew, but in every passenger who watched a quiet woman absorb injustice and respond with poise instead of fury. Vanessa didn't need headlines. She was the headline, and everyone on that plane now knew it. The cabin was quiet, eerily so. As United Flight 342 taxied toward the gate at San Francisco International Airport, but it wasn't the usual stillness that came after a long flight. This silence carried weight, reflection, regret, awakening. Passengers in first class, who had once exchanged awkward glances or looked away entirely, now found themselves sneaking respectful looks toward Vanessa Cole, the woman who had been told, just 11 minutes before, "You don't belong here." But now, everyone knew exactly who she was. Not just a passenger, not just a black woman. She was the newly appointed interim director of inclusion and ethics at United Airlines. And after everything that happened on this flight, no one would forget that name again. Vanessa remained composed as the plane came to a full stop. She didn't rush to gather her things. She stood gracefully, adjusted her navy blazer, reached for her leather tote, and stepped into the aisle. A man from row 1B, who earlier hadn't said a word while she was being humiliated, now stood up and quietly said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that." She gave him a soft nod, acknowledging his words without bitterness. But it was the woman in 2C, who had watched the entire scene unfold in silence, who now reached out and gently touched Vanessa's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing your ground, for showing us how to do it with grace." At the front of the cabin, Lindsay Hartman, the same lead flight attendant who had questioned Vanessa's right to be there, was no longer posturing with confidence. Her face was pale, her eyes lowered. She held her hands tightly in front of her, fidgeting with her watch strap like a student waiting outside the principal's office. As Vanessa approached, Lindsay opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Vanessa didn't stop walking. She passed her with the quiet dignity of someone who didn't need revenge to feel whole. Behind Lindsay, Captain Rollins stood outside the cockpit, hat in hand. He looked older than he had at takeoff, worn, humbled. "Miss Cole," he said, voice low but sincere, "I offer you my full apology and full responsibility for what happened today. Vanessa stopped this time. She looked him in the eye and replied clearly enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. Captain, respect should never be situational. You don't offer it based on clothing, or skin tone, or titles. You offer it because we're human beings. He nodded. No defense, no excuses, just silence. She turned to go. As she stepped through the aircraft door and onto the jet bridge, a young flight attendant, one of the newer hires, who hadn't said much earlier, whispered, "Thank you for saying what so many of us couldn't." Vanessa offered her a smile. "Then say it next time," she said kindly, "because silence helps no one." The moment she entered the gate area, 2 United Airlines executives were waiting, public relations staff trailing behind with tense smiles and phones in hand. The story had traveled fast. A video clip from a passenger in row 3 had already gone viral on X. The caption read, "Black woman told she doesn't belong in first class, then fires the crew, justice served." But Vanessa had no interest in fanfare. She looked past the executives, past the flash of media interest, and walked toward a group of airline interns standing near the service desk. They wore matching blue United pins and looked nervous, unsure of what to say. Vanessa extended her hand to each one. "I know this wasn't what you expected to witness today," she said warmly, "but maybe it's what you needed to see. What happened on that plane isn't just about a few bad apples. It's about what happens when we don't speak up. You have a choice. Make this company better than what we saw today." One of the interns, a young Latina woman with trembling hands, looked up and said, "We will, because of you." Vanessa smiled, then turned to the cameras now surrounding her. She raised one hand, not to wave, but to speak. "I'm not here to destroy people's careers. I'm here to build something better." Today was a lesson, not just for United Airlines, but for every company, every crew, every employee who makes assumptions based on how someone looks. The next time a black woman walks onto your plane, or an elderly man who speaks broken English, or a young person wearing thrifted clothes, remember what you saw today, and treat them with respect from the moment they step on board. Don't judge a book by its cover. There was no need for applause, no mic drop moment, just truth. As Vanessa walked away from the gate, the world behind her began to shift. The crew she had quietly dismissed would face accountability. Training programs would be overhauled. Inclusion policies would be rewritten with her at the helm. But most importantly, hearts had changed. And that's where real reform begins. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you in the next story.